might feel so far away now. I'm really happy that you decided to start your term joining us on this. I think it's our 31st Teach Econ chat. And in here, we are going to be talking about working with student data. We have the usual housekeeping rules. We are recording the session, so you can rewatch the session on the CTaLE YouTube channel later. And please do keep the mics off during the session, but feel free to, or feel encouraged as well, to use the chat to ask questions or to add comments, to add material as well. Usually we have a very vibrant chat. And we have Clodagh Jenkins today managing the chat. So hi, Clodagh. So before we actually start the question, before we actually start the session and talking to our panelists, let me tell you a little bit more about the topic that we are covering today. And today we are going to be focusing in particular on student data. As economists, we really understand, appreciate, and sometimes overvalue a little bit the value of data and the data collection. When we talk about student data, or at least when we are going to be talking about student data today, we are going to be referring to a broad range of data that is collected from students at universities in particular. In this session, we're going to be highly focused on UK because of our panelists and because of the work that we have been doing. And I have here, just to give you some idea of the data we are talking about, divided the data by different categories. We have a student personal characteristics, so gender, nationality, ethnicity, but also religion, socioeconomic background, the school that they attended, etc. This data is usually not readily available for all of us. That's data that belongs to the university, or at least is held at university level. A lot of this data is going to be subject to GDPR, and there are other constraints. But universities do have this data, and some of us have used this data to do research. There is also the student outcome data. So this is going to be data that is created after students join the university. This is going to be usually linked to attendance to lectures, seminars, when these are recorded, marks obtained during coursework exams, and anything at module level more in general. Nowadays, more virtual learning environments such as Moodle or Blackboard do record student engagement with resources that are made available. So this is kind of student outcome data that I have called it here. And of course, we also have qualitative data. Again, this is data that is generated after the students join the university, and it's data that we collect on student views, opinions, perceptions about their teaching or any other aspects of the university life. Of course, this data is going to be available at different levels, at national level. I'm going to very briefly mention something about that, but it's also available at university level. And I think Gabriella has worked a lot with that data at university level. We have a program level, a module level, and I think other panelists have worked a lot on these things as well. So at national level, this is perhaps one of the main contributions I'm going to do to this workshop, and going to be talking about the Higher Education Statistics Agency, what we friendly call the HESA data. The HESA data is data that is collected by the Statistics Agency in the UK for UK students and for students studying in a higher education public institution in the UK. We can find very detailed data for all universities on student personal characteristics, such as the place of study, the courses that they are studying, the modules that they are studying, the entry qualifications, socioeconomic backgrounds, progressions through higher education. Every year, universities submit this data to HESA, and HESA provides a wide range of tables and charts about the student population in higher education. For instance, we're going to get information on trends on student registration to undergraduate, postgraduate studies. We also get trends for where students study, like the location, what do they study. And if you look at the HESA website, there is a of comparison, trend comparisons across years, across institutions, across different kind of categories. It's a very good data set, but there is what I find one of the biggest shortcomings of this data set is that it's quite pricey. So if you want to work with this data set, you need to be aware that you have to pay for it. In addition, you pay for a single observation in a way. So it depends, you need to have a very clear research question and understand what exactly you want to get out of the data set to when you start buying for the data set. Otherwise, you're going to end up asking for a lot of data and the price just goes up. So my recommendation is if you want to work with HISA data, be very clear about the research question. Then you have to talk to the people in HISA. They are very kind and they organize a series of meetings with you. But all these meetings are good to understand what data exactly you need. Otherwise, as I said, costs keep going up. Then there is data at university level. This is data at your university. Of course, as we said, universities do submit the data to HISA. So of course, at your university, you will have all the information that is given to HISA. So if you are interested in just looking at a single university level comparison, so for instance, look at what happens in the wording gap by demographic groups in your university, you can actually just use the university levels. Of course, some limitations of this is going to be that you don't have the cross-section data that you have with HISA across different universities, and you might be limited on the type of comparisons that you can do. And perhaps the data that we are more familiar here, and I'm going to talk less, is going to be about program level and module level. So program level, for instance, you might have data that is available for all L100 students or all students registered for the BSc in economics. This data is going to be very useful for teaching practices to understand what awarding gaps are within the discipline, within your program, and how you can improve teaching practice assessment methods. A module level is more specific. So perhaps if you have introduced a specific pedagogical change, you want to see how this has affected the student performance, you can use these levels. But I'm going to not say too much about this because I think Gabriella and especially Anastasia, Gabriella, and also Chris are going to talk a little bit more about this. So with this very long introduction, I'm going to now move and talk to our panelists. And we have 3 panelists that have a long experience working with data. I have Professor Gabriella Cagliesi from the University of Sussex, and she has published quite a lot in this area. And we also have Anastasia Papadopoulou that's working currently with student data and has few working papers and few projects working in trying to improve a student experience. And we also have Chris Downey, that's professor of education. And so he's bringing the education perspective in here and telling us a little bit more on how we can use data to improve education. So let me start with Gabriella and Anastasia first. And let's start with Gabriella, but the question is the same for both of you. So Gabriella, let me stop sharing because I think you need the screen. I think from your experience in working with data from economics students, sorry, I had my notes and I lost them. Yeah, how do you find that it's working with this data? Can you tell us kind of how can we help our colleagues aiming or trying to work with this data at the moment? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I prepared some slides to share some of my views and experience. And thank you, Steffi, to do this. So a little bit of my experience with data. So as Steffi was saying, there are different type and level and granularity of the data. So, and I arrived at the institutional data rather than started from. And I'll carry on saying what I've done with this data and what I think are the benefit or the advantages of using data and what to consider when we're using this data. So my background and experience with data started as a macroeconomist. I am an applied macro And so I used, we had lots of secondary data, as you imagine, right? International, national. I used financial time series from Bloomberg. So it was plenty of data at any frequency, it really was a great data set, panel and time series. I also use data from Understanding Society, so it's a mixture also of variables and perception, so that I did really enjoy working with that data to analyze the effect of returning to work after maternity and the youth unemployment, so with Denise Oaks. And so it's a great thing to work with secondary data that is all clean and comes to you easily, because one of the problems with then getting to institutional data is that the cleaning up. Then I also work with the primary data, surveys and market data on non-professional traders, so more specific, non-secondary, primary, and also that was great fun. Again, it was given to me by professionals, so I didn't have much to worry about how to clean the data. Then, as Steffi said, we worked on the education data, HISA data, and it's a huge amount of data. It's not individual, it's a university, and you have groups of students per university, so you know the percentage of white student, black student, Asian, or you have information about gender, and so it's a very good, and as Steffi said, the data on entry, it's good to work, it's a good data set. And then I have worked with education data at institutional, admin institutional data from University of Greenwich, where I started this, started being interested in this type of data, and University of Sussex, where I am at the moment. So what is with the use of institutional data? What motivated me? So Steffi said that there are different levels. There is a module, there is a course, there is a school, a university. My interest started almost by chance, to be honest. And then I discovered that I was very interested. So it really, my motivation was very much personal, because I heard, and this backs to 2011, so a few years ago, I started listening to this conversation about awarding gap. And, you know, I thought I didn't have any gap, because I had this module of macroeconomics, intro, advanced, intermediate, and advanced. I knew my student very well, but everything was done anonymously. So I thought, oh, for sure, I don't have a gap. I don't have anything. I have essay, exams, and something called Patchwork, that was a test with analytical questions as well as empirical questions. And as you can see, I had a consistent attainment gap. So I took it as a really personal mission to understand, why did I have this gap? I mean, I always consider myself to be a fair person. I mean, so my interest is in institutional data and module data. So we had a wonderful dashboard at Greenwich University. So I started working with this data, and with the data, why did I work with data? To devise some informed evidence-based intervention. Based on this data, I changed the essays by allowing feed forward, and then at the end I decided to change the pedagogic approach that I had, and I changed into something called team-based learning. And then a few years later, I collected again the data, and I discovered that, in fact, the awarding gap had disappeared. So that was, for me, enough to say, okay, I need to use granular data. I need to know my surrounding, because if I want to understand students' experience, I need to look at the microscope, not the macro. I use another motivation an additional motivation came from COVID, right? So this, I'm talking about module data, aggregate data. So this, I use this data, which it's more complicated because it comes from the institution at institutional level, but then it is a granular and module level. So it needs to be the data set needs to be triangulated and merged, and everything is anonymous. So it did require a lot of work. And clearly I had a research assistant, and then we ended up working on this project to understand the effect of the switch into, there was like a natural experiment. One term was the normal teaching and the normal assessment, and the other term, everything changed into online and assessment, and it was a no detriment policy. So it was a very natural setting for a different experiment. So our module data, we analyzed the effect of these changes. So the nice thing about the institutional data and having granular data is that you can exploit the distributional dimension. So look at the distribution of the grades and then to understand patterns, shifts, and evaluating intervention. So that was another use of data aggregating across modules. And then the third one, it is more at school level. It is used to compare what I call compare the comparable. Meaning when there was an issue to understand the impact and the value for money of foundation year courses. And I was interested in understanding, because the government policy is going to change, as you know, about this foundation year. And the government figures showed something that I was not really convinced, because in my view, they were comparing groups that were not totally comparable. And so if you don't have institutional data where you can match samples, it becomes more complicated, because you are taking just the average of a group. But, taking averages, as I tell my students, because I was told by my teacher, when you take the average of a rainbow, the color is white. So you lose a lot of information. So to me, to compare, really to understand the effect of foundation year, I needed to have two similar group, a counterfactual group, to see who was not exposed to the treatment. So therefore I did this study, and I'm doing this study using this dimension. So using the information coming from the granularity of the data to match a student and draw some robust conclusions. Also, it is clearly, it is again, you need to be sure of the quality of the data, and it's not always easy to get the data from the at the institutional level, but I think that's more meaningful than what the simple comparison of average groups done by the government, or no comparison, not even a simple t-test. So this was applied to foundation year. I think there are lots of other additional benefit of using, in addition to being able to look more at the microscope. I think there is, as I said, you can use it for inspiring or devise some data-driven decision-making processes and design some targeted intervention. I think one interesting would be to understand the value or the effect of placement in the student performance. And because, there is a selectivity there. So I think that by matching groups, one can understand better the effect of placement. And then one can identify student risks, so identify the typology of the student who could have some support, because among the data that I received, there is data on receipts, on numbers of impairment, on reasonable adjustment, on support, flagged support. So it's a lot more that one can learn. And then also it's, as I said, serves as a foundation for research within the institution, empowering researchers to explore questions related to the learning experience. And I think it also fosters a culture of improvement, because when I discovered that I did have a BAME awarding gap, I was shocked. I couldn't believe it. And then clearly it was my intention to put any remedial action to remove it. So there are, however, I mean, there are also some costs and some things to be about.
Gabriella, can I, because we're going to come back to perhaps some of the challenges.
Oh, yeah, I leave it there. Yeah.
So let's leave it there. Let's move to Anastasia, and then we come back to this point. Thank you. Hi, Anastasia. Same question for you. So kind of just tell us a bit about your experience and perhaps the difference of being working with data in your normal economics research. Thank you.
Great. So let me share also my screen. I have prepared also 2-3 slides, not much, but so I thought to discuss a little bit this from actually my experience and what I realized while working with the data. Till now, I have worked with both primary and secondary student data. So I thought to just split it in these 2 different categories and just discuss a bit what I learned, or things that I believe it's good to have in mind for anyone that would like to use student data a little bit more. So the first thing regarding primary data is that one of the main ways to get data from students is through student surveys. So there, someone might think of the trade-off between stated and revealed answers. So a survey versus an experiment. What are the, how can you incentivize a survey? So, and how can you, quote unquote, convince students to actually respond to the survey? So from my experience, there are 2 different types of, or at least I know about the 2 different things that we did. So one was kind of surveys in class, because there was a different way of teaching, was part of the class, of the course. So there I administered the surveys to the students in the class. So in that case, the sample is potentially larger, so you might have quite a large sample. However, possibly there are high attrition rates, and it's not that easy to collect a full repeated sample in case someone would have liked, you know, to have a before and an after, and then make sure that the same people respond to both surveys, so you can follow and compare the answers. So people might need to have this in mind, because not always you can incentivize these surveys in the course. So I followed a little bit the chat discussion, and indeed different institutions have different guidelines of how you can do these things. So it's better first to make sure if and how you can incorporate or incentivize these surveys in the course, or connect them to the grades of the course or other type of activities. One thing that I found useful is that we need to think a little bit when will be the timing for the survey. So one thing is when the researcher wants the students to answer the survey. Another thing is that we know that students have to respond to quite a few surveys throughout the semester. So maybe timing the survey of the project not to be at the same time with other surveys, or be, I'm not very sure, but I don't know if students also at some point reach kind of a survey fatigue. So then there you see even lower numbers of responses. I have just an example from one of the projects. So for an example, when we ran it in the class, we concentrated mainly in close-ended questions. So to make it also a bit quicker and easier for students to respond, you can ask questions on attitudes about the interactive exercises, which was what we were using, towards economics in general, and any other type of questions. But again, just to have in mind about the attrition rate. On the other hand, if there is a separate pedagogic innovation, so it's something that happened outside the course, outside the curriculum, even outside the term time, then what happens is that the attrition rate could be quite low. However, potentially the sample is smaller and probably selected. So there is this trade-off between the sample size and the people and the attrition rate. The reason there is that obviously students are selected to a specific process, and then also if you let them know from the beginning that part of this workshop, let's say, will be for you to answer some questions, some surveys, even if they are optional, still students expect this, so they actually participate more. So for an example, in the other project, we ran a workshop, and there we used open and close-ended questions on their attitudes about the workshops in general, about the social atmosphere of the workshop, more on the use of pair programming, which is what we were using to teach students Python. And I saw that the attrition rate was quite lower. Then something else that it might be a little bit different to what I was used in my field research is that there are other methods that are quite useful to collect student data, like focus groups or interviews. And these are methods that I think can give you a lot of valuable information that you cannot take just from qualitative data. So this was my snapshot of things that I wanted to mention about primary data. Now regarding secondary data, and again, some of these things might have been already discussed by Stefania or Gabriella, so I'm going to echo these things, and I will just move on. But one thing that I had in mind is that actually data, and I'm focusing on institutional data. Yeah, so I'm focusing on the data that we can get from specific institutions. So what is probably good is that we know that there is a complete data set. So we know that all the people that are there, all the students, we have a complete data set for all of them on their grades, on their performance, on some demographic characteristics, as also Stefania was mentioning. So we know the data is there. Or to rephrase it, we know that for the variables that the university collects, the data is there. However, of course, we might not have access to all this data. We might need to follow certain procedures. Again, might be different for different institutions. And it needs extreme care to anonymize this data so no student is identifiable. And of course, if the analysis is on aggregate levels, then by definition, there's no problem of identification of any particular student. So for an example, in the project that we're using secondary data, we collected module level grades per component and overall, because we wanted to see the effect of group work summative assessments. And we collect them for 2 academic years for all UG courses. So there, the data are on aggregate. Now, as I mentioned briefly, some variables that someone might need might not be in the data set, because the main goal of the universities is not actually to collect data for research purposes, but it's to collect data for administrative purposes. So either they might not be there, or they might be collected in a way that needs a lot of work behind it to recode it, or go and find different bits and pieces of information from different sources and combine them together. The problem is that if a variable is not there, then most probably there are no alternative data sets or proxies that someone could use, as probably would have done with other type of secondary data, to answer the question. And just, Stefania, it's just 1 minute, and I'm going to summarize it. I see you. Just a minute. Just to say that in terms of replicability and generalizability, I believe the same things apply with empirical data used for field research. What might be more important is that most of the times the data might not be open access, and that means that we have to treat the data as we would have treated the restricted access data in field research. And of course, generalizability depends on institutional framework. But I'm gonna stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anastasia. Again, we're going to go back to some of these points in a second, but let me just go and ask Chris now. Chris, you have heard a little bit of what is the work that we are doing as economists with education, but also, and you know that kind of as economists, we love data and everything, but of course there is also the pedagogical aspect of this, the literature aspect that any research question needs to take into account. And perhaps my question for you is, from the education perspective, what do you think are the insights that economists working with data can bring to the education literature? And perhaps you can help us, what are the current most relevant research questions that we can help to address with our work?
Thanks, Steffi, and thanks, colleagues, for presentation of your work there. I find it really fascinating, Gabriella and Anastasia, the context where you're researching and looking at the blend of secondary data through to your own institutional data and thinking about how that intersects with your own practice as educators too. So I really appreciate the breadth of what you brought there. And I think it's those range of research questions that's really interesting. I was sharing with Steffi in preparation for this how in my background as someone who has a heritage in working in school effectiveness, and particularly working with data related to the compulsory phases of education, that whole discipline owes a huge debt to colleagues from economics and econometrics in particular, methodologically, to look at ways in which we were able to give more definite answers to research questions around the benefits of compulsory schooling. And it's really only recently, despite having been in higher education for quite some time, that with more management roles in education, in higher education, I've sort of turned that lens around and started to think how we would do more in-depth analysis of our own internal data in a university setting. And I think for me, one of the things where if I'm bridging between those two worlds is a really major development within the context of looking at the effectiveness of schooling was being able to model prior attainment and prior learning in our analyses. And I guess for me, turning this around into a question for colleagues here in the workshop, I'd be really curious to know what you think of the challenges and the go-to data that we might utilize as variables in our analyses to just capture that variation in our student cohorts. So we have a sense, because of the selectiveness of higher education, that many of our student cohorts are relatively homogeneous in terms of their prior attainment. And yet when they're with us in those early years of study, I think the kind of practitioner sense that we get is we've got quite a varied student cohort in front of us. And so I'm always curious, particularly in the HE context, what data can we bring to bear that might act as direct measures or as proxy measures of that prior attainment? Do we need to draw through measures of pre-higher education attainment? That's a challenge because we know we've got diverse student bodies. Not all of them necessarily come with a set of 3A levels. And so how do we map equivalencies across different educational systems in terms of measures of prior attainment that students bring? Would we dare undertake our own initial attainment analysis in perhaps the first semester of undergraduate education to give students a benchmarking test? And then what would that look like? And if we thought of learning gain more widely and considered things such as academic self-concept or motivation, Gabriella, I think I heard you mention in your input, what would it look like to gather our own internal data on those and use those as more distal measures of prior attainment, or that sense of application that our students bring to the discipline of study, and how might they improve our modelling? And I think just drawing that together, where institutionally we have very strong and understandable imperatives about issues such as attainment gaps amongst students from different backgrounds. For me, understanding the heterogeneity of our student body in that way is going to be fundamental in our thinking as to how we really get to grips with what those attainment gaps are. Because I can tell you, immediately, and I'm sure you know already, years and years of compulsory schooling are things that have perhaps developed some of those attainment gaps and certainly established them, even if it's not intentionally. I'm sure it's never intentionally. And so to what extent do we as practitioners in higher education just then inherit those and maintain those, and then going into the black box of practice and starting to think, well, what can we do in terms of our teaching, our pedagogy, and I would also raise our assessment methodology that could help us address some of those attainment gaps and turn those around. So many of those gaps are inherited, but that doesn't absolve us with the responsibility of doing something about them. So hopefully in a general sense that picks up some of the issues for me, which are the burning ones. And I'm really intrigued to talk to experienced colleagues about how you might tackle some of those thorny questions.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you everybody for panelists. There is a lot of questions already coming up in the chat in a way, and I'm gonna start perhaps with the last question, and I think it's something that worries a lot of us in a way working in this field, and is publishing these results. So going backwards, and perhaps I'm gonna ask the different experiences that you have published in these and how does it count towards your promotion and all these kind of things, because two things. One thing is like the possibility to publish this, and perhaps this is a question more for Gabriella and Anastasia, the possibility of publishing this in economic journals. We know that within the economics field, it's going to be more likely that economics journals are highly ranked for our promotion criteria. But also, how can we switch our perhaps brains in a way if we are actually keen to publish into educational journals? Although we did have a whole session about publishing some time ago, but perhaps if we pick up a little bit on that question, perhaps tell us about the challenges that you found in publishing this in economic journals, or whether you find an alternative outlet for your work, and how did your department make this work for your promotion criteria. Don't know who wants to start. Let's start with Gabriella again.
Thank you. Well, when I started, I didn't have much in mind to publish. It was, as I said, it started as a personal interest. Then, in fact, as I collected more evidence, and along 3-4 years after I started using this different approach, I noticed, at the beginning, I started going to conferences and to present it, and I noticed that there was an interest in that. And I think the fact that I could have some hard evidence and good methodology helped me in that. And in a way, strategically, I thought, how can I prove it? How can I evidence? So in my advice is, when you do a research and when you start the research question, I think you should start thinking, how can I evaluate? How can I prove it? How can I show it? So with thinking in mind that to answer that question. So like I did also show that during the period that I was lucky to have the same student through all term, and one term through all year. Then 1 year I adopted team-based learning. One term I started doing the normal, and another term I would do the team-based learning, which relates also to a question someone asked. So some variables were kept constant, some other changed. So I could really create a different diff, right? So, but I had in mind, I wanted, and I gave students a survey. They had to give every time, every lecture. It was a little survey, an emoticon. They had to tell me. So they were anonymized, and they had to tell me what was the emotion of the day. And it was very clear that there was a big change in emotion from one term to another. So I think that in order to publish, it is possible to publish. I did publish also in economic education, a journal of economic education. So, But I think you have to be very strategic in being precise, clear, and transparent in collecting the data, and very robust in your methodology. And then make a case, and then I think you start with presenting it, collecting feedback. And then I think I find also very good colleagues to work with, and good data I had. So my suggestion is, yes, don't get discouraged. It is possible. And I belong to a university where the dean, the associate dean, they all valued the research that I was doing, and they gave me funds. So it was maybe in a way I was lucky, but I didn't find big obstacles in progressing into a career.
Thank you very much, Gabriella.
Actually, it helped me.
Yeah, so I guess that's a very good point. So try to find something that your institution is going to value in terms of the students, and then perhaps you can progress your research into that field. Anastasia, do you want to add something to this? You are finding any challenges in publishing, or?
Actually, I would like to echo Gabriella's points on, having the data, do the best you can, having a very robust methodology. I think that the basic principles of research apply in both cases. Now, regarding publications, unfortunately, I don't have much experience to tell you what a journal might want, or what might be very different from a field research journal to an education pedagogy journal, because I'm checking the chat and I see that there is a discussion there. And because also, as Jana was mentioning in the chat, I come also from an experimental economics background. So I see the same, kind of arguments on the data and on the surveys, on the experiments. So I think that the best way to go is try to make the question as robust as possible. Try to find people that you would like to work. I totally agree with that point. Everything becomes much, much better. And then target a journal, go to conferences, get, whatever I would have done in a field research project.
Thank you very much, Anastasia. And Chris, I think you already addressed a little bit this on the chat. You say certainly in higher education journals, you can publish. What Claudia was asking was about like small samples and other things. You say as long as your design are robust. Can you tell us a little bit more what you mean by a robust designs for an education outlet?
I guess I was just trying to defend education journals, that they're still looking for robust research. But I think there's a recognition working within higher education that we, particularly where we know access to internal data can be challenging enough, let alone drawing together data across multiple institutions, that we're going to be working with perhaps reduced sample sizes compared to those engaging with large secondary data sets such as HESA data, or from my experience, the National Pupil data set, for example. So I think there's a recognition of the smaller end. I could see in the chat some mention of particularly thinking about experimental designs in our research, which tend to have an expectation of being smaller end studies. I think that's fair to say. Very happy to hear anyone who would want to give a different perspective on that. But I think there's a recognition, if you are doing some kind of intervention-based design and you've got a robust design there, there's an expectation that those would be lower end, and so can be more manageable and practical particularly from a practitioner researcher point of view. We're engaging with our own practice or practice within a department and looking to see the impact of change. I think the other thing I would add is a real encouragement to colleagues working in economics, because you bring a range of analytical skills that your colleagues in other schools would really value, that you can bring to the table. And so reaching out across to colleagues in other disciplines and thinking about how you might do a multidisciplinary study and share the perspectives that you have from working across different disciplines. So we're beginning to do that in our social sciences faculty, where economics is part of a bigger group within its own school. but then also sits within a wider set of disciplines, including education and law and the business school and mathematics, interestingly, as an unusual member of a social sciences faculty here at Southampton. And thinking about how we can collaborate across those disciplines brings the benefit of being able to consider some wider pedagogical and assessment methodology type issues, going back to what I said about going inside the black box of practice and looking for variables that we can bring into our models there. So would encourage you to do that, because I know you have insights and a set of skills that other colleagues will be very happy to collaborate with.
Thank you very much, Chris. And perhaps that brings us very well to actually one of the first questions that appeared on the chat. And it was that, other than GDPR issues, what are the institutional policy reasons why they might be worried about allowing access to this data? So I think because sometimes, and I personally have found it, that it's very challenging sometimes that universities do not want to share this data despite of the researcher proposing like good research ideas. And I also read that in Germany, for instance, that seems to be easier. So, but it seems that in the UK, I find it a little bit more difficult. But I kind of opened this question more. We also have Parma here, Claudia, who are my co-organizers, and now they're very important at university level, so they can help to think about these things. But if anyone wants to share a light, perhaps I start with Chris again, and then we move backwards. And Parma and Claudia, I put you in the spotlight, can think in the meantime.
Yeah, Steffi, sorry, I was just engaging so much with the chat there because I was expecting you to come back to me last. I have to confess, I missed the specific point you were wanting.
That's okay, no worries, I can repeat it. So it's why universities, and not just because GDPR reasons, but why are other reasons they might not want to share data, student data, with researchers aiming to do research? And we saw that in other countries seems that this is a bit more feasible, but in the UK, UK universities seem to kind of not been that willing to share this.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. The comment that the response I put in the chat was a very practical one in terms of just the perception of the resource that would be required to do bespoke extracts of data. I'm astonished at when colleagues who work in our admin teams tell me just how long it takes to run database queries to be able to extract data from our systems. I sometimes get them saying, could you not limit it perhaps to just one or two departments rather than the whole faculty? Could you not reduce the number of variables you ask me because it's running overnight and then it's crashing the next morning, or I've managed to get it for these two small departments, will that do? And of course that makes me sigh so much because if we can't get ready access to the data, that's really frustrating. So rather than colleagues working in administration of student data, I've tended to go to our internal, what we call our data analytics and insight team, who are very much involved in looking at data to inform institutional policy. And they are used to, and I think have a bit more grunt to their devices that they use to do those kind of really complex queries to our internal databases. And investing, even if you don't need data next week or the week after, investing in time to invite them out for coffee, talk to them about the kind of projects that you want to do with internal data, asking them how easy it would be to get access to data of various types, particularly if you're looking for student background, demographic data, and there's sensitivity associated with those. We've certainly found, and Jana Sade, who's in the call now, and I have been doing just that with colleagues from our own data insights team, and found them to be really open and interested in the kind of projects that we're wanting to do. And so what we're trying to do is establish a culture where we can even put a code book together for various data that we have, and make it easier for colleagues then to access the same kind of data that we're trying to extract ourselves, I think.
Okay, that's thank you very much, Chris. I think that's very useful. I don't know if anyone, even from the audience, can add something, but I think, like, yeah, we never think about actually the proper admin job that requires to actually extract the data. And I think that's very good considerations. I can broaden also a little bit the question. I don't know if anyone's thought about any other potential constraints in the meantime. But also what I was thinking about right now was about the ethical constraints and the ethical approvals and the kind of things. And perhaps I'm going to go to Anastasia, because I think you have gone through ethical approval processes quite recently. And if you want to tell us a little bit about the process and like the difficulties that you find, and any recommendations that you can give us, that would be super useful.
Yes, sure. So regarding the secondary data, I think the process is very much the same as with any other type of secondary data that are not, let's say, open access. So it's important to submit the ethics form beforehand, explain how you will anonymize the data if they are not already anonymized in the database, how they will be stored, how they'll be used, till how long someone will hold the data, who will have access to the data. So sometimes if you want to combine data from different sources or institutions, you might be asked to sandbox the institutional data, and then each researcher works on this data on the respective institution. And then it depends again on the different institutions. Some institutions might ask for specific data management plans, security plans, different type of agreements. Some other institutions might have different procedures, but it's more or less what we have in mind for the rest of the ethical approvals. Now, regarding the primary data, I treated it as running an experiment. So I used my knowledge from then of preparing the ethical form. So I think what is very important is to obtain consent from students beforehand. So before collecting any data, obtain consent from all students that they will be used. Make sure that, to explain again how we will anonymize this data, better maybe, better from a GDPR concern or an ethics process concern is, if you don't need them not to be anonymized, just collect them anonymously. So you don't have this extra worry of identifying individuals. And then I think it's also important for the ethics process to explain if the procedure and the participation is voluntary. If it's not voluntary, then some institutions might have increased concerns of how this will be implemented. And again, is it in a course? Is it not in a course? Do we want to make it compulsory for students to respond and things like that? So explaining this nature of the survey and the goals of the survey, I think in the ethics form is important. The last thing I want to, I'm thinking of here is, what about experiments? Because there are colleagues even here that they have run experiments with students, and it seems that in some institutions, the ethics process is a little bit different and maybe a bit trickier than in other institutions. One of the main questions I have come across is, how are we going to guarantee that one of the groups, let's say the control or the treatment, in most cases the treatment, will not be in a disadvantaged position? And then it might not be that, we know the answer, might not be that straightforward to write down the answer and make it clear in the ethics form. I think that.
Thank you very much, Anastasia. And I think, Gabriella, perhaps you want to add a couple of things to these, or you agree, let us know.
Sorry, I was muted. Yes, I totally agree with the resources. I was surprised when at Greenwich we had a beautiful data with a dashboard, but there was a strong gatekeeper, so you had to go through a lot of requests. When I moved to Sussex, it was surprisingly easy to get the data, and it was a huge amount of data. Then what became very difficult, it was the update of the data, because the person who had helped me the first time around had left, and to re-anonymize and map also because things change a long time, the way things are measured. So I think I had underestimated the amount of time that needed to be used to update this data. So just to mention, I asked for an update of the data file that I have, which is a big one, and has been now 9 months, 10 months, and they tell me, oh yeah, we're doing. So it does require to them extra time. So unless it's something that it is priority for the institution, you may have to wait. And then there is, so apart of the difficulties due to resources and ethical considerations, they are also worried that, you know, in giving this data, they have to make sure that some of the thresholds are valid, because if the data, like a module has a fewer students than 10, I don't know how much that was, they have to remove the data. So it does require some process for them to do. And then they want to know exactly what you're going to do with the data, where you are storing the data. So it is sometimes there are some hurdles. So if you can have your own data, primary data, it's also very good. You have more control over it. There is a problem on using surveys that have been validated, so that you are measuring exactly what you know that is measuring something that has already been measured. So I think that has to be considered carefully in using surveys that are validated. So that you get quality data from it. And so you're measuring something that it is actually meant to measure. So that all the things that have been said, I can't just, I can reinforce this. However, I mean, it's a lot of insights that one can gain from the data, and definitely has made me, I think, closer to my students and to the reality of the institution I'm working with. So I think there are, as I said, personal advantages, and also as you start working with data and you know the variables that you have, more and more research question comes. So it is sort of a domino effect.
Thank you very much, Gabriella. And I just want to say thank you to all the panelists. It's been like, just to summarize, especially on the ethical thing, let me say, if you are even thinking about that at some point you might work with data, just start looking at what is going to be your institutional ethical approval process, because very likely you need it. Very likely it's completely different from different institutions. At least in the UK, we find that like in some places are very easy, some places are very difficult. Those places that have a big experimental economics department, they tend to have a fast approach, I have noticed. Those places that with not a big experimental group tends to be a bit more tricky in a way. But all these, so thank you very much again, Chris, Gabriella, and Anastasia. Has been very useful conversation. Now we are not leaving just yet. We have our second part of the session that's going to be about the communities of practice, and this is going to be, we're going to have 2 groups, and I'm waiting for Manisha to put the groups on the chat.